Hi, Dr. Pulsfer here to talk about a pretty serious subject, violence in games. And this is going to be a two-parter because there's a lot to talk about. There are really two questions. One is about conflict in games, such as war games, and the other is about obvious violence in games, which usually amounts to depictions of violent death. Violence can certainly be disguised, as in Small World. It's a war game, it's about slaughter, conflict is ever present, but somehow it's been sanitized, perhaps because the fantasy aspect and the abstract feel. The key to this is you don't see any death. There's no hint of aggression, only competition. Some people object to violence in games. Some people go further and object to conflict in games. Now, traditionally, games like novels involve conflict. You go back far enough, virtually all games involve conflict. Conflict between players, if there's more than one player. Now, video games have changed that. The conflict is between player and computer. And the computer, until recently, wasn't much of an opponent. And now, with free-to-play games ascendant, where you want to entice people to keep playing, you want to make it easy for them. The computer is a playground, not an opponent. Now, we could talk briefly about what is violence. Is an auction violent? There's a conflict, but there's no tearing down. There's nothing you can see that looks ugly or annoying. Worker placement? Well, exclusive worker placement has a conflict. Tic-tac-toe, there's a conflict there. Is it the tearing down that's violent? But even tearing down can happen in business games rather than war games. It certainly happens in real life. Many people confuse competition with aggression and don't like aggression, not surprisingly. And those people are not going to like any kind of game that has conflict in it. Now, we can, as an aside, discuss conflict in business and war. The difference is, in war there are few rules. There are rules. In business, there are lots of rules, national and local laws that constrain the conflict, though these are sometimes ignored. In business, the government provides an overwhelming power of regulation, usually. There's no power regulating war, usually. No, the real problem here is the deliberate depiction of violence, blood, and gore. Video games have tended to depict violent death for a long time. I wrote an article several years ago, The Virgin Mary of Video Games, and that's a reference to Renaissance paintings where Virgin Mary was often present. Well, in video games, depictions of violent death are often present, the big video games, not the casual video games. There's a URL for that. When I wrote that piece, and this is back in 2010, I was regularly getting material published on Gamasutra, which is the professional video game creators site. And at first they accepted this one, then changed their minds, which was the only time that ever happened. I think it was because it could be seen as too critical of gamers. I don't like violence. I have a PhD in military history because military history is interesting and intricate and absolutely insane. It's one of the craziest things humans do, but it's very, very common. So I have no liking of violence, but virtually all classical two-player games are conflicts, though sufficiently abstract that one doesn't think of them as violent. Some people think that chess began as a kind of representation of Indian warfare, East Indian in this case. Nobody knows for sure, but certainly it's just an abstract game to us. So chess, checkers, Go, tic-tac-toe, those games involve conflict. The only alternatives were race games such as Pachisi for 4 players and much later backgammon. And even backgammon has conflict. And dicing, of course, which doesn't have direct conflict. Modern games that try to remove conflict, or at least direct conflict from the game, descend spiritually from card games, which are post-medieval, race games, and party games, not from classic board games. Games are supposed to be outside reality. A vital aspect of games is the magic circle that separates the game from reality. If we can't accept conflict within the magic circle, we're losing an important aspect of games that lets us do things in the game that we could not do or would not do in the real world. That's a considerable part of the appeal of games, doing something not part of your real world. And I have a couple screencasts referenced here about separating games from reality. My conclusion is if you can't separate games from reality, maybe you shouldn't play games. But nowadays, people have trouble separating themselves from the rest of reality. Egotism comes in here and narcissism. By the way, as an aside, you've heard the notion that German games, quote unquote, aren't violent because Germans don't want to play such games. Actually, that came from shop owners who didn't feel they ought to be selling conflict games to families. An American video game producer turned academic once told me that downright violent video games, including his Middle-earth real-time strategy game, sell just fine in Germany where that tabletop shop owner barrier does not exist. Now, I've played games all my life where people get killed, that is, units get eliminated. But the killing is part of a war, and war dominates human history. In video games, the killing too often appears to be for the sake of killing, as in a typical shooter. And it's a very personal killing, complete with blood and body parts. Historical games are generally more like Risk. You don't feel and certainly don't see that anyone is dying. And even if you did, you wouldn't get pleasure from it. The purpose is to win the war and stop the bloodshed, not to glorify bloodshed. The best generals win with little to no bloodshed. It's rare, but it does happen. Parents generally don't mind seeing plastic or wooden pieces removed from the board in a game like Risk, but they do mind seeing realistic-looking humans exploding in clouds of gore on a computer screen or TV set. If we don't mind getting philosophical, a general problem in modern society is that people feel powerless. Young people are protected constantly, and in schools competition is minimized and people are rewarded for mere participation. The kids know that the self-esteem that the schools are trying to build is false, because the kids don't actually achieve much. An awful lot of K-12 is memorizing things, regurgitating them. That's not creative. That's not doing anything useful. Without outlets for feeling powerful through being productive, people tend to turn to places where they can feel powerful through destruction, as in many video games, and the internet in general, of course. That's one of the reasons for the nastiness in general on the internet. So, it's not surprising that violent video games are so popular. Violence makes the destruction obvious, even visceral. Now keep in mind, most people in the world are not able to own guns, yet the violent games are just as popular in those places. The notion that violent games promote violence has a huge hurdle because virtually no one dies of guns in Britain or Japan, at least compared to a place like the United States. Violence is much less widespread there, though not unknown, but violent games are as popular there as elsewhere. I'm going to talk more about this topic in part 2.